In a quiet Missouri kitchen, a 72-year-old woman was about to discover her son's betrayal. What started as making afternoon tea took a shocking turn when she overheard Marcus dismissing her as too senile to know while plotting to steal her property. Diana Kraft wasn't your typical confused elderly woman. For 45 years, she had shaped young minds as a high school English teacher, known for her razor-sharp intelligence. When she encountered her son's cruel manipulation, she had no idea she was about to wage war for her independence. Diana's grief-driven facade would lead to an epic battle for dignity and freedom that would transform her small Missouri town forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The kettle's whistle pierced the afternoon quiet of Diana Kraft's Victorian kitchen, its urgent cry cutting through the stillness that had settled over the house like dust on her grandmother's china. Diana moved with the careful, measured steps she'd perfected over the past 2 years, not quite shuffling, but slow enough that Marcus would notice her decline during his increasingly rare visits. She reached for the bone china teacup, one of the few pieces from her wedding set that hadn't been relegated to the display cabinet after Robert's death. The familiar weight of it in her hands brought a momentary comfort, a connection to the woman she'd been before grief taught her to hide behind confusion. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across the worn hardwood floors that Robert had refinished 3 times during their 47 years of marriage. Diana had been meaning to call Ruby about their weekly bridge game schedule. Their Thursday meetings had become sacred in the way that only widows understood. Reliable anchors in a world that had suddenly become unmoored. She lifted the old rotary phone from its cradle on the kitchen wall, the receiver heavy and substantial in her palm. But instead of the familiar dial tone, voices crackled through the line. Marcus's voice, tight with stress. "Can't keep putting this off, Jen. The second mortgage payment is due next week, and with the layoffs looming at the office," Diana's hand froze. She should hang up. Should give them privacy. But something in her son's tone kept her listening, a quality she hadn't heard since he was 16 and calling his girlfriend after curfew. "I know, Marcus." Jennifer's voice carried that particular strain of a woman trying to hold everything together. "But your mother isn't some stranger. We can't just—" "She's too senile to know the difference anyway." The words hit Diana like a physical blow. Half the time, she can't remember what she had for breakfast. "You saw her last week, asking me 3 times who I was." Diana's breath caught. She remembered that visit perfectly. Had watched Marcus's face grow more frustrated with each repetition of her carefully crafted confusion. Had seen the way Jennifer's nursing background made her take notes on a small pad, documenting what she believed was Diana's deterioration. "The property assessment came back at $400,000, Marcus continued, his voice taking on the calculating tone he used when discussing insurance policies at work. "Even after paying off the remaining mortgage, we're looking at enough to solve our immediate problems and set aside college funds for both kids." "Marcus," Jennifer's voice held a warning. "What? She's not using the land anymore. When's the last time she gardened or maintained anything? Frank Kowalski told me he's been doing her yard work for months now, and she doesn't even seem to notice." Diana's grip tightened on the receiver. Frank's quiet help with the heavier chores had been a kindness she'd been grateful for, a gentle assistance that preserved her dignity. She'd never realized Marcus saw it as evidence of her incapacity. "I already toured 3 facilities," Jennifer said, her voice dropping to a conspirative whisper. "Sunset Manor has a lovely room available, garden view. She'd have activities, social interaction, proper medical oversight. And we'd have the house," Marcus finished. "Tommy's looking at colleges, Sarah needs a car, and my job security isn't exactly guaranteed in this economy. Mom would be safer, we'd be financially stable. Everyone wins." "Except she hasn't agreed to any of this," Jennifer pointed out, though her protest lacked conviction. Marcus's laugh held no humor. "She hasn't disagreed either. Most days she just nods and smiles. Dr. Martinez mentioned that's common in early-stage dementia. Patients become very agreeable, very passive. Makes the transition easier for everyone." Diana's mind reeled. Dr. Martinez had mentioned no such thing because Diana had never shown any signs of dementia during her appointments. But she had been vague about her symptoms, had nodded along when the doctor asked about memory concerns, had let Marcus speak for her during the visits when he bothered to attend. The social worker said we could probably expedite the competency hearing if we document enough incidents, Jennifer continued. I've been keeping notes on her behavior. The repetitive questions, the forgotten appointments, the time she left the stove on. She left the stove on? Diana whispered to herself, then clamped her hand over her mouth. She'd never left anything on. Jennifer was fabricating evidence. We need to move quickly, Marcus said. Frank mentioned some cousin from California has been sniffing around, asking about inherited properties in the area. If Mom gets any ideas about changing her will or setting up some kind of trust— She won't, Jennifer interrupted. She trusts us completely. You're her only child, Marcus. She depends on you to make the right decisions. The word depends echoed in Diana's mind. How had her grief-born performance become such a prison? When had her son learned to speak about her as if she were already gone? I'll call the lawyer tomorrow, Marcus decided. Set up the preliminary paperwork for guardianship proceedings. And maybe schedule another visit with Dr. Martinez. Get an official assessment on record. What about Tommy? Jennifer asked. He's been asking questions about why we keep talking about Grandma moving. Tommy's 16. He'll understand when he's older that we made the right choice for everyone involved. Marcus's voice carried the finality of a man who'd made his peace with an ugly decision. Besides, he's so wrapped up in his girlfriend and college prep, he barely notices what's happening around him anyway. Diana thought of her grandson's last visit, how carefully he'd listened to her stories, how he'd helped her plant the new rose bushes by the garden gate, how his eyes had narrowed when she'd pretended to forget his name, as if he could see through her performance. I should go, Marcus said. Conference call in 10 minutes. Can you handle the Sunset Manor paperwork? Already on it. I'll have the admission forms ready by Friday. Good. This'll all be over by Christmas. Mom will be settled, we'll have some breathing room financially, and the kids will have their college funds secured. The line went quiet, then clicked as they hung up. Diana stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the life she'd built with Robert, listening to the dial tone that seemed to mock her with its steady electronic pulse. Her reflection caught in the kitchen window, a 72-year-old woman in her late husband's cardigan, holding a phone that had just delivered the most devastating news of her life. But her eyes, looking back at her, weren't confused or clouded. They were sharp with intelligence and growing with something that had been dormant for too long: fury. Diana Kraft, retired English teacher who had spent 45 years teaching students to think critically and question assumptions, had just discovered that her own son planned to dispose of her like an unwanted piece of furniture. And he believed he could do it because she'd taught him to see her as helpless. She set the receiver back in its cradle with the precise control of someone whose mind was anything but deteriorating. The tea kettle had stopped whistling, the water now perfectly still. But inside Diana, something that had been quiet for 2 years was beginning to roar. The masks we wear to protect ourselves, she thought, remembering a line from a poem she'd taught countless times. Sometimes they become our cages. But cages, as any English teacher worth her gradebook knew, were only as strong as the person inside them chose to believe. Diana looked around her kitchen, Robert's kitchen, their kitchen, and began to plan. The performance was over. But Diana's hands trembled as she set down the phone. The weight of 2 years' worth of careful deception pressed against her chest like a stone. She moved through her kitchen with sudden clarity, each step deliberate and sure. No more shuffling, no more hesitation. The woman who had just overheard her son's betrayal was not the same woman who had picked up that phone. Robert's study called to her, its mahogany shelves lined with the books they'd collected together over nearly 5 decades. She pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the sanctuary that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and the leather-bound volumes he'd treasured. His reading chair sat empty by the window, the afternoon light casting it in golden relief. Diana sank into her own chair across from his, facing the large framed photograph on the desk between them. Robert at 68, just months before the heart attack, his eyes crinkled with the smile that had sustained her through 4 decades of marriage. His silver hair caught the light in the photo, and she could almost hear his gentle laugh, the one that had gotten quieter in those final years but never lost its warmth. "Oh, Robert," she whispered to his image, her voice steady for the first time in months. "What have I done to us? To our home?" The photograph seemed to regard her with patient understanding. How many conversations had they shared in this room? How many student papers had she graded while he worked on his carpentry projects? How many evenings had they spent here, reading together in comfortable silence, building the life that Marcus now saw as nothing more than a financial opportunity? "I've been hiding, haven't I?" Diana continued, her voice growing stronger. "I told myself it was grief, that I needed time to heal, but the truth is, I was terrified. Terrified of living without you, of facing this world alone." She traced the edge of the photograph with one finger. "So I became what everyone expected, a confused old woman who couldn't manage on her own." The silence in the room felt profound, as if Robert were listening from somewhere beyond the veil that separated them. Diana had always been a woman of words, but grief had stolen her voice, replaced her eloquence with carefully crafted confusion. She'd become an actress in her own life, playing a role that grew more confining with each performance. "You would have seen right through it," she said with a bitter laugh. "You always could tell when I was putting on an act. Remember when I tried to pretend I wasn't nervous about that tenure review? You just raised that eyebrow of yours and handed me a cup of tea." The memory brought both comfort and pain. Robert had known her better than she'd known herself sometimes. He would have called her out on this charade months ago, would have refused to let her diminish herself in the name of grief. A soft knock at the front door interrupted her reverie. Diana glanced at the antique clock on the mantel, 3:30 on the dot. Ruby Chen, punctual as always for their weekly tea. For a moment, Diana considered not answering, continuing her conversation with Robert's memory. But Ruby's persistence was legendary, and Diana knew her friend would simply let herself in if needed. Diana rose from her chair, pausing to touch Robert's photograph one more time. "Help me find my way back," she whispered. "Help me remember who I was before I became so afraid." She walked to the front door, her steps sure and steady. Through the etched glass panels, she could see Ruby's compact figure, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the October wind. Diana's hand hesitated on the doorknob. Once she opened this door, she would have to choose continue the performance or risk everything by telling the truth. Ruby Chen had been the first real friend Diana had made after Robert's death. They'd met at a grief support group that Diana had attended exactly 3 times before deciding it was too painful to continue. But Ruby had approached her after that 3rd meeting, pressed a business card into her hand and said, "Coffee tomorrow. There's a place downtown that makes decent scones, and I refuse to mourn alone." That had been 18 months ago. Since then, Ruby had become Diana's anchor, the one person who seemed to see through the fog of her grief to the woman underneath. If anyone would understand what Diana was about to reveal, it would be Ruby. Diana opened the door. "You look like hell," Ruby announced without preamble, pushing past Diana into the foyer. She wore a vibrant purple coat that complemented her silver hair, and her dark eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, immediately assessed Diana with the precision of someone who'd spent 30 years as a librarian cataloging the subtle differences between truth and fiction. "Hello to you too, Ruby," Diana replied, but she found herself smiling despite everything. Ruby's directness had always been refreshing, a counterpoint to the careful politeness that most people employed around widows. "I'm serious," Ruby continued, unwinding her colorful scarf. "You have that look, like someone who's just seen a ghost. Or worse, like someone who's finally decided to stop being one." Diana froze. Ruby's perception had always been unsettling, but this felt like she was looking directly into Diana's soul. "I don't know what you mean," Diana said automatically, falling back into the vague confusion that had become her default response to direct questions. Ruby stopped unwinding her scarf and fixed Diana with a stare that could have melted steel. "Oh, cut the crap, Diana. I've been watching you shuffle around like a lost sheep for months, and I know perfectly well that you're sharper than half the people in this town. The question is, what happened today that finally woke you up?" The mask slipped before Diana could catch it. For just a moment, her real self, intelligent, angry, and utterly betrayed, flashed across her face. Ruby caught it immediately. "There she is," Ruby said softly. "There's the woman who taught half this town to think critically. The one who could dissect a Shakespearean sonnet and make it relevant to teenagers who'd rather be anywhere else." Diana felt the facade crumbling around her like old plaster. She'd spent so much energy maintaining the performance that she'd forgotten how exhausting it was to pretend to be someone else. The relief of being seen, really seen, was overwhelming. "Ruby," Diana said, her voice carrying the full weight of her desperation, "I need to tell you something. But if I do, there's no going back." "Good," Ruby replied firmly. "Going back is overrated anyway. Now, are we going to stand in this foyer all day? Or are you going to make us some tea and tell me what's really going on?" They settled in the kitchen, the same room where Diana's world had shifted just an hour earlier. Ruby took her usual seat at the round oak table, the one that gave her a clear view of both the garden and Diana's face. Diana busied herself with the tea service, grateful for the familiar ritual that gave her hands something to do while she gathered her courage. "Marcus called," Diana began, then stopped. How did one explain 2 years of deception? How did one admit to being complicit in their own diminishment? "And?" Ruby prompted, her patience evident but limited. "I overheard him talking to Jennifer." Diana set down the teapot with hands that had steadied remarkably. "They're planning to have me declared incompetent. They want to move me to Sunset Manor and sell the house." Ruby's eyebrows rose, but she didn't seem shocked. "I see. And what did you tell them when you confronted them about this plan?" "Nothing," Diana admitted. "They don't know I heard them." "Ah." Ruby leaned back in her chair, studying Diana with renewed interest. "And why exactly do they think they can have you declared incompetent?" This was the moment of truth. Diana looked into Ruby's expectant face and made her choice. "Because I've been pretending to be confused for 2 years," Diana said in a rush. "Ever since Robert died, I've been acting like I'm developing dementia. Forgetting things, asking repeated questions, seeming lost and helpless. I told myself it was grief, that I needed protection from having to face the world without him. But really, I was just hiding." The silence that followed felt endless. Ruby's expression didn't change, but Diana could see her friend's sharp mind working, connecting dots, reassessing months of interactions. Finally, Ruby spoke. "You magnificent fool." "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me." Ruby's voice held a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "Do you have any idea how worried I've been about you? How many times I've wanted to shake you and tell you to snap out of it? I knew something wasn't right, but I thought it was just grief making you retreat into yourself." Diana felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You knew?" "Of course I knew. You think I spent 30 years working with the public and can't tell the difference between actual cognitive decline and someone who's choosing not to engage?" Ruby leaned forward, her eyes intense. "The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" "I don't know," Diana admitted. "Marcus has already started the process. Jennifer's been documenting my incidents, taking notes on everything I say and do. They have evidence, Ruby. Evidence that I gave them." "Then we'll have to make better evidence," Ruby said matter-of-factly. "Evidence that shows exactly how sharp and capable you really are." "We?" Ruby's smile was fierce. "Oh, my dear friend. Did you really think I was going to let you fight this battle alone? You've been hiding for 2 years, but I've been paying attention. I know exactly who Diana Kraft really is, and it's about time everyone else remembered too." Diana felt something shift inside her chest. a loosening of the tight knot of fear and shame she'd carried for so long. For the first time since Robert's death, she wasn't alone. "Ruby," she said softly, "I'm scared." "Good," Ruby replied. "Fear means you're finally awake. Now, tell me everything about this conversation you overheard, and let's figure out how to save your life." As Diana began to recount the devastating phone call, she felt the last vestiges of her performance falling away. The confused, helpless woman she'd been pretending to be was finally, completely gone. In her place sat Diana Kraft, teacher, fighter, and woman who refused to be invisible any longer. The real battle was just beginning. The tea had grown cold as Diana finished recounting every word of Marcus and Jennifer's phone conversation. Ruby sat across from her, taking notes in a small leather journal with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades organizing information. Her silver pen moved across the page in sharp, economical strokes, capturing not just the facts but the implications behind them. "So they've already toured facilities," Ruby said, tapping her pen against her lips. "Jennifer mentioned having paperwork ready by Friday, which means they're moving faster than you might expect. That suggests urgency." "Marcus mentioned layoffs at his company," Diana offered, feeling strange to be discussing her son's life as if he were a case study rather than the boy she'd raised. "And college expenses for both children. Financial pressure makes people do desperate things," Ruby observed. "But it doesn't excuse what they're planning." She looked up from her notes. "Diana, we need proof of what they're really up to. Documents, recordings. Evidence that shows this isn't about your welfare, but about their financial gain." Diana felt a chill of apprehension. "You mean search through their things?" "Ruby, I can't." "You can and you will," Ruby interrupted firmly, "because if you don't, you'll lose everything. Your home, your independence, your dignity. Is that really how you want Robert's legacy to end?" The mention of Robert's name hit its mark. Diana straightened in her chair, feeling the steel that had carried her through decades of challenging students and difficult parents beginning to resurface. "Marcus still has his old bedroom upstairs," Diana said slowly. "He and Jennifer stay there when they visit overnight. They might have left papers, documents. Good. What about his computer habits? Does he use your internet when he's here?" "Sometimes. He complains that the connection at his house is slow, so he brings his laptop here for work calls." Diana paused, remembering. Last month he spent hours on it, said he was researching something for his job. Ruby's expression grew predatory. "I doubt it was insurance policies he was researching. We need to see what websites he's been visiting, what documents he might have saved or printed here." They climbed the stairs to Marcus's old bedroom, Diana's footsteps sure and steady for the first time in months. The room still held traces of the boy he'd been, a faded high school pennant on one wall, a bookshelf filled with Stephen King novels and outdated computer programming manuals. But it also bore the marks of recent adult occupation, a briefcase in the corner, file folders stacked on the desk, Jennifer's reading glasses forgotten on the nightstand. "Start with the briefcase," Ruby instructed, pulling on a pair of reading glasses. "I'll check the desk. We're looking for anything related to assisted living facilities, property assessments, legal documents, financial records." Diana hesitated at the briefcase's latches. This felt like a violation, a crossing of boundaries that couldn't be uncrossed. But then she remembered Marcus's casual dismissal of her intelligence, his cold calculation of her property's worth, and her hands moved with sudden determination. The briefcase was unlocked, a mistake that spoke to Marcus's confidence that his mother posed no threat. Inside, Diana found a manila folder labeled "Mom's Situation" in Jennifer's neat handwriting. Her heart sank as she opened it. "Ruby," she called softly, "you need to see this." The folder contained a systematic documentation of Diana's supposed decline. Jennifer had been keeping detailed notes for months, recording every instance of Diana's performed confusion with the clinical precision of her nursing background. There were dates, times, specific quotes of Diana's repetitive questions, and disoriented behavior. October 3rd. Asked who Tommy was 3 times during dinner. Ruby read aloud. October 10th. Left kitchen faucet running, seemed unaware when Marcus pointed it out. October 15th. Couldn't remember Jennifer's name, called her dear repeatedly. Diana winced at each entry, remembering the deliberate choices behind every recorded incident. I was so careful to seem just confused enough. I thought I was protecting myself. You were building a prison, Ruby said bluntly, but not unkindly. She continued reading. October 20th, Dr. Martinez appointment. Patient was vague about symptoms, nodded along with family concerns about memory issues. Recommend follow-up cognitive assessment. Jennifer was at that appointment, Diana remembered. She answered most of the doctor's questions for me. I let her because it seemed easier than explaining symptoms I didn't really have. Ruby flipped through more pages, her expression growing darker with each entry. Here's a printed email from Sunset Manor. Rates, availability, admission requirements. She paused. And here's something interesting. A property tax assessment, recent, with notations about development potential. Diana leaned over to read the document. Someone had highlighted the assessed value and made handwritten notes in the margins about commercial zoning possibilities and local real estate trends. They're not just planning to sell the house, Diana realized. They're planning to develop the land. 15 acres this close to town would be valuable for commercial development, Ruby agreed. Shopping centers, medical facilities, senior housing, ironically enough. Your son isn't just solving his immediate financial problems, he's setting himself up for life. The sound of a car door slamming in the driveway made both women freeze. Diana moved to the window and peered through the lace curtains. A familiar blue Honda was parked behind Ruby's car. Tommy, Diana breathed. My grandson. He comes by most Saturday afternoons. Ruby was already closing the folder, returning it to the briefcase exactly as they'd found it. Can you trust him? I don't know anymore, Diana admitted. Marcus said they've been coaching him about my condition. They descended the stairs quickly, Ruby slipping into the kitchen, while Diana positioned herself in the living room with a magazine, resuming the pose of confused elderly woman that had become second nature. The front door opened without a knock. Tommy had his own key and the casual comfort of someone who considered this his second home. Grandma, his voice called out, young and warm and achingly familiar. In here, dear, Diana replied, carefully modulating her voice to the vague tone she'd perfected. Tommy appeared in the doorway, 16 years old, and growing into the height he'd inherited from Robert's side of the family. His dark hair was disheveled from the October wind, and he carried his ever-present backpack slung over one shoulder. But there was something different about his expression today, a tension that Diana hadn't seen before. How are you feeling today? He asked, settling into the chair across from her. The question itself was routine, but his eyes were watchful, assessing. Oh, you know, Diana replied, letting her voice trail off vaguely. Some days are better than others. How was school this week? Fine. Tommy's answer was unusually short. He studied her face with an intensity that made Diana uncomfortable. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. Do you remember what we planted last weekend? In the garden? Diana's mind raced. They had planted rose bushes by the garden gate, a project Tommy had suggested and that she'd enjoyed immensely. But a confused woman wouldn't remember such details clearly. We worked in the garden, she said carefully. Didn't we? Or was that… When was that? Tommy's expression shifted, disappointment and something else. Suspicion? Flickering across his young features. The roses, Grandma. We planted 3 rose bushes. You told me about how Grandpa Robert proposed to you under a rose arbor. Diana felt the trap closing around her. If she remembered too clearly, she'd break character. If she remembered too little, she'd hurt her grandson, who had clearly treasured that conversation. Roses, she repeated slowly. Yes, I think Robert loved roses. Ruby appeared in the doorway as if summoned. Diana? Oh, hello there. You must be Tommy. I'm Ruby Chen, your grandmother's friend. Tommy stood politely to shake hands, but Diana caught the way his eyes moved between them, noting details with uncomfortable precision. I should probably get going, Ruby said. Diana, don't forget about our bridge game Thursday. Same time as always. Bridge game? Diana repeated, letting confusion color her voice. Every Thursday for 6 months now, Ruby said patiently. I'll call to remind you Tuesday. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After Ruby left, Tommy remained standing, his backpack still slung over his shoulder as if he might leave at any moment. Grandma, he said finally, are you really as confused as Mom and Dad think you are? The directness of the question caught Diana off guard. She looked into her grandson's face, Robert's eyes in a younger version of Marcus's features, and saw an intelligence that reminded her painfully of herself at that age. Why would you ask such a thing? She deflected. Because sometimes you seem perfectly fine, and other times you act like you don't know what's going on. And lately, whenever Mom asks me about your behavior, it feels like she wants me to say you're worse than you are. Diana's heart clenched. So Marcus and Jennifer were trying to turn her own grandson into a witness against her. What kind of questions does your mother ask? Diana asked, dropping some of the vagueness from her voice despite herself. Tommy noticed immediately. His eyes sharpened. She asks if you seem confused, if you repeat yourself, if you remember things wrong. She writes down what I tell her. He paused. But, Grandma, you just asked me a really clear, direct question. Someone who's confused wouldn't do that. Diana realized she was at a crossroads. She could continue the performance, potentially losing her grandson's trust and making him complicit in her own diminishment. Or she could take a risk on the young man who carried Robert's eyes and her own love of truth. Tommy, she said, her voice clear and strong, what I'm about to tell you must stay between us. Can I trust you with something very important? His face lit up with a combination of relief and excitement. I knew it. I knew you weren't really confused. You're too smart for that. Your parents are planning to move me to an assisted living facility and sell this house, Deanna said directly. They believe I'm incompetent to make my own decisions, but I've been performing that incompetence to avoid dealing with my grief over your grandfather's death. Tommy sank back into his chair, processing this information with the seriousness of someone far older than 16. So you've been pretending to be confused? Yes, and now my pretending has given them the evidence they need to take away my independence. Diana leaned forward. Tommy, I need to know. Have your parents asked you to say specific things about my behavior? The boy's face flushed. Mom said it would be helpful for your doctors to know about any concerning incidents. She said family observations were important for diagnoses. He paused. She gave me examples of the kinds of things to watch for. What kinds of examples? Memory problems, confusion about time or place, difficulty with daily tasks. Tommy's voice grew smaller. She said if I noticed things like that, I should tell her so she could help you get proper care. Diana felt sick. Jennifer had been coaching her grandson to become an unwitting spy, gathering ammunition for their case against her competency. Tommy, have you told her about times when I seemed confused? He nodded miserably. But Grandma, I was trying to help. I thought you really were getting sick and they were trying to take care of you. Oh, sweetheart. Diana reached out to take his hand. You weren't wrong to want to help, but your parents aren't planning to help me. They're planning to help themselves to my property. She told him about the overheard phone conversation, about the documents upstairs, about the calculated nature of Marcus and Jennifer's planning. With each revelation, Tommy's expression grew more serious, more adult. What are you going to do? He asked finally. I'm going to fight back, Diana said. But I need allies I can trust. People who know the real me and can help prove that I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Tommy straightened in his chair, and for a moment Diana saw the man he would become. Strong, principled, protective of those he loved. What do you need me to do, Grandma? Diana smiled, feeling hope bloom in her chest for the first time in 2 years. Her grandson was looking at her with respect, with love, and with the recognition of her true capabilities. It was a beginning. Help me gather evidence, she said. Help me document who I really am. And help me make sure that when this battle comes, and it's coming soon, I'm ready to win. Tommy grinned, and Diana saw Robert's mischievous spirit shining through her grandson's eyes. Mom and Dad have no idea what they're up against, do they? No, Diana replied, feeling stronger than she had in years. They really don't. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only October in Missouri could deliver. Diana stood at her kitchen window, watching the maple trees shed their crimson leaves across the yard that Frank Kowalski had so carefully maintained. For the first time in 2 years, she felt truly awake, as if she'd been sleepwalking through her own life and had finally opened her eyes. The phone call to Dr. Martinez's office had been surprisingly easy to make. Diana had simply called, identified herself clearly and coherently, and requested an appointment for a routine checkup. The receptionist, a young woman named Melissa who had been one of Diana's students 5 years earlier, had been delighted to hear from her former teacher. "Mrs. Kraft, you sound wonderful this morning. It's so good to hear your voice clear and strong." The comment had been innocent enough, but it reinforced what Diana was beginning to understand. Her performance of confusion had been convincing enough to worry people who genuinely cared about her. The thought filled her with shame, but also with determination. If she could perform incompetence convincingly enough to fool people who loved her, surely she could perform competence convincingly enough to fool people who were trying to exploit her. Now, sitting in Dr. Martinez's waiting room, Diana felt the weight of what she was about to attempt. This wasn't just about fooling anyone. This was about revealing her true self to a medical professional who had been monitoring what she believed was Diana's cognitive decline. It would require delicate navigation between honesty and self-preservation. The waiting room was familiar territory. Soft beige walls decorated with watercolor landscapes, comfortable chairs arranged around low tables stacked with well-worn magazines. Diana had been here countless times over the past 2 years, each visit a carefully orchestrated performance of vague confusion and gentle bewilderment. Today, she sat straight-backed in her chair, reading a Time magazine with obvious comprehension and retention. Diana Kraft? The medical assistant who called her name was new, someone Diana didn't recognize. This was good. No preconceived notions about her mental state. Dr. Sarah Martinez's office reflected the woman herself. Efficient, but warm. Practical, but compassionate. Diplomas and certifications covered one wall, while the other displayed photos of the doctor with various community groups and medical mission trips. Dr. Martinez herself was younger than Diana had expected when they'd first met, barely 40, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Mrs. Kraft," Dr. Martinez said, looking up from a chart that Diana knew contained months of documented concerns about her mental state. "You look very well today." "Thank you, doctor." "I feel well." Diana's voice was clear and steady, carrying the authority she'd once used to command a classroom full of teenagers. Dr. Martinez's eyebrows rose slightly. She set down the chart and leaned back in her chair, studying Diana with renewed interest. "Your voice sounds much clearer than during our previous visits. Are you feeling less confused today?" This was the moment of truth. Diana met the doctor's gaze directly. "Dr. Martinez, I need to speak with you frankly about my situation. What I'm about to tell you may surprise you, but I need you to understand that I am fully competent and capable of making my own medical and personal decisions." The change in Dr. Martinez's expression was immediate and profound. The polite concern she'd shown to a potentially declining patient was replaced by the sharp attention of a physician encountering an unexpected development. "I'm listening," she said simply. "I have not been experiencing cognitive decline," Diana said clearly. "For the past 2 years since my husband's death, I have been performing confusion as a way to avoid fully engaging with my grief and the changes in my life. It was a coping mechanism that became a trap." Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, her medical training clearly warring with her personal surprise. "Mrs. Kraft, that's a very serious statement. Are you telling me that during our previous appointments, when you seemed disoriented and forgetful?" "I was acting," Diana confirmed. "Not consciously at first. The grief was real, and the initial confusion was genuine shock and emotional trauma. But as time went on, I found that playing the role of a confused widow meant people expected less of me, demanded less engagement. It felt safer. But your family has expressed significant concerns about your mental state. Your son Marcus has called several times, worried about your declining condition. Diana's jaw tightened. My son is concerned, yes, but not about my welfare. Doctor, I need to ask you something important. Have you ever told Marcus that patients with early dementia become passive and agreeable, making transitions to assisted living easier? Dr. Martinez looked startled. I would never say such a thing. That's not medically accurate, and it's certainly not something I would discuss with family members without the patient present. She paused. Why do you ask? Because Marcus told his wife that you had said exactly that during a phone conversation I accidentally overheard. They're planning to have me declared incompetent and move me to assisted living so they can sell my property. The doctor's expression grew grave. Mrs. Kraft, those are serious allegations. Are you certain about what you heard? Diana recounted the phone conversation in detail, watching Dr. Martinez's face grow more concerned with each revelation. When she finished, the doctor sat in silence for several minutes, clearly processing the implications. If what you're telling me is true, Dr. Martinez said finally, then we need to establish, officially and thoroughly, your current cognitive status. Would you be willing to undergo comprehensive neuropsychological testing? That's exactly what I was hoping you'd suggest. Dr. Martinez opened a drawer and pulled out a standardized cognitive assessment form. We'll start with a basic evaluation today, but I want to schedule you for more extensive testing with a neuropsychologist. I need to document your current mental status completely and accurately. The tests began immediately. Dr. Martinez started with the mini mental state examination, a standard screening tool that Diana recognized from her research into dementia symptoms during her performance preparation. Questions about orientation to time and place, memory recall, attention and calculation, language skills, and visual construction. What year is it, Mrs. Kraft? 2023. What month? October. What's the date today? October 23rd, a Monday. Where are we right now? I'm in Dr. Sarah Martinez's office at the Missouri Valley Medical Center on Elm Street in Cedar Grove, Missouri. Each answer came clearly and immediately. Dr. Martinez made notes, but Diana could see surprise in her expression. During previous visits, Diana had hesitated over such questions, given vague or incorrect answers, seemed unsure of basic information. I'm going to give you 3 words to remember, Dr. Martinez continued. Apple, penny, table. Can you repeat those back to me? Apple, penny, table. Good. Now I want you to count backwards from 100 by sevens. 100, 93, 86, 79, 72, 65, 58, 51, 44, 37, 30, 23, 16, 9, 2. Dr. Martinez's pen had stopped moving. She was staring at Diana with something approaching amazement. Can you tell me those 3 words I asked you to remember? Apple, penny, table. They moved through the rest of the assessment, language tasks, following complex instructions, drawing intersecting pentagons, writing a complete sentence. Diana performed flawlessly on every measure, demonstrating not just normal cognitive function, but the sharp intelligence of someone with advanced education and years of intellectual engagement. Mrs. Kraft, Dr. Martinez said when they finished, your performance on this assessment is not just normal, it's excellent. You're scoring in the superior range for someone of any age, let alone someone in her 70s. During my previous visits, what did I score? Dr. Martinez consulted her notes. Your most recent assessment 6 months ago showed significant deficits. You scored 18 out of 30 on the MMSE, which indicates moderate cognitive impairment. And today? 30 out of 30. Perfect score. They sat in silence for a moment, the implications hanging heavy in the air between them. Doctor, Diana said carefully, I need to ask about something sensitive. If my family were to pursue guardianship proceedings, what role would your medical assessment play? Dr. Martinez's expression grew serious. Any guardianship proceeding would require medical evidence of incapacity. Based on your previous assessments and my documented concerns about your cognitive function, your family would have grounds to petition for guardianship. And based on today's assessment? Based on today's assessment, any such petition would be medically unfounded. Mrs. Kraft, I need to be very clear about something. If your family is planning to use my previous medical opinions to support a claim of incompetency, they're doing so under false pretenses. The office phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Dr. Martinez glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "Excuse me for just a moment," she said, answering the call. "Dr. Martinez. Yes, this is she." "I see. Well, Mr. Kraft, your mother is actually here in my office right now." Diana felt her stomach drop. Marcus was calling, likely to discuss her deteriorating condition, and perhaps to lay more groundwork for his plans. "No, I can't discuss specific details of her condition without her consent," Dr. Martinez continued, her voice professional but firm. "However, I can tell you that she's perfectly capable of participating in her own medical care. Yes, she's here voluntarily." "No, Mr. Kraft." She drove herself to the appointment. Diana could hear Marcus's voice through the phone, though she couldn't make out the words. His tone was elevated, clearly agitated. "Mr. Kraft, I understand your concerns, but I need to be clear about something. Your mother is demonstrating excellent cognitive function today. If you have concerns about her safety or well-being, I'd be happy to discuss them with both of you present, but I cannot share confidential medical information." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Dr. Martinez maintaining professional boundaries while clearly pushing back against Marcus's assumptions about Diana's condition. When she finally hung up, her expression was troubled. "Your son seems very convinced that you're experiencing significant cognitive decline," she said. "He mentioned several specific incidents: leaving appliances on, getting lost while driving, forgetting family members' names, all of which I performed deliberately," Diana said. "Doctor, my son genuinely believes I'm incapacitated because I convinced him I was. But his motivation for having me declared incompetent isn't medical care, it's financial gain." Dr. Martinez leaned back in her chair, clearly processing the ethical and medical implications of what she was hearing. "Mrs. Kraft, I need to ask you something difficult. If you were performing cognitive impairment deliberately, why are you revealing the truth now?" "Because I overheard my son and daughter-in-law planning to move me to assisted living and sell my property without my consent. Because I realized that my grief-driven charade had become a weapon they could use against me. And because I refused to lose my independence and my home to a performance I created to protect myself from pain." "This is an extraordinarily complex situation," Dr. Martinez said slowly. "From a medical perspective, I now have clear evidence that you're cognitively intact, but I also have months of documented evidence suggesting impairment. Any legal proceeding is going to question this dramatic change. Which is why I need thorough, comprehensive testing that definitively establishes my current mental status," Diana said. "I need documentation that can't be questioned or dismissed." Dr. Martinez nodded. "I'm going to refer you to Dr. Patricia Wong, a neuropsychologist who specializes in comprehensive cognitive assessments. Her evaluation will include hours of testing across multiple domains: memory, attention, language, executive function, emotional status. It will provide a complete picture of your cognitive abilities." "How soon can this be arranged?" "I'll call her office today. Given the circumstances, I think we can expedite the appointment." Dr. Martinez paused. "Mrs. Kraft, I need to be clear about something. As your physician, I'm obligated to document accurately what I observe. Today's assessment will be recorded as showing normal cognitive function. If your family questions this change, I'll need to explain that cognitive abilities can fluctuate, and that today's examination revealed no signs of impairment." "You won't mention my performance?" "Patient confidentiality protects our conversation today. But Mrs. Kraft, if this situation escalates to legal proceedings, you may need to explain the discrepancy between your previous presentations and your current abilities." Diana nodded. "I understand. Doctor, can I ask for your professional opinion about something? Of course. If someone were experiencing genuine grief-related depression and anxiety, but not cognitive impairment, what would appropriate treatment look like? Dr. Martinez smiled for the first time during their appointment. Counseling, potentially medication for depression or anxiety, gradual re-engagement with social activities and meaningful pursuits. The goal would be helping the person process their grief while maintaining their independence and dignity. Not assisted living? Definitely not assisted living. Mrs. Kraft, grief counseling and assisted living are completely different interventions for completely different issues. As Diana prepared to leave, Dr. Martinez handed her a card. This is Dr. Wong's information. I'll call ahead to explain the situation. I'm also going to give you something else. She wrote on a prescription pad and handed Diana the paper. This is documentation that you are cognitively intact and capable of making your own medical, legal, and personal decisions. Keep it with you. Diana looked at the paper, feeling tears prick her eyes. For 2 years, she'd been hiding from official recognition of her capabilities. Now, holding medical documentation of her competence felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she'd thought was lost forever. Dr. Martinez, she said, thank you for listening, and for seeing me clearly. Mrs. Kraft, I've been concerned about you for months, not because I thought you were declining, but because something about your presentation never quite fit. A patient with genuine cognitive impairment doesn't perform poorly on tests with such consistency. Today makes much more sense than our previous appointments ever did. As Diana walked to her car, she felt the weight of accomplishment mixed with apprehension. She now had medical validation of her competence. But she also had a timeline. Marcus's phone call to Dr. Martinez suggested he was moving forward with his plans faster than she'd anticipated. The battle for her independence was no longer theoretical. It was beginning, and she needed to be ready. But for the first time in 2 years, Diana Kraft felt truly equipped to fight. The brass nameplate on the office door read, James Murphy, attorney at law, in simple, dignified lettering that reflected the man himself. Diana stood outside the familiar building on Main Street, gathering her courage for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of her life. Through the window, she could see James at his desk, silver-haired and serious, reviewing documents with the methodical attention that had made him one of Cedar Grove's most respected attorneys. She had taught James Murphy during his junior year of high school, back when he was a gangly teenager more interested in basketball than books. It had taken her months to crack through his disinterest and discover the sharp analytical mind beneath his athletic facade. She'd been the one to suggest he consider law school, had written his recommendation letters, had attended his graduation 25 years later with the pride of a teacher who'd helped shape a life. Now she was about to ask that life to help save hers. The reception area was modest but comfortable, decorated with local artwork and framed news clippings of James's more notable cases. His secretary, a woman Diana recognized but couldn't quite place, looked up with a warm smile. Mrs. Kraft, Mr. Murphy is expecting you. Please, go right in. James rose from behind his desk as she entered, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. Diana Kraft, as I live and breathe. You look. He paused, clearly noting something different about her demeanor. You look like yourself again. Hello, James. Diana settled into one of the leather chairs facing his desk, appreciating how he didn't rush to help her or treat her like a fragile elderly woman. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. For my favorite English teacher? Anytime. James resumed his seat, but his expression grew more serious as he studied her face. Though I have to say, you sound different than when Marcus called last month asking about power of attorney documents. Diana's stomach clenched. Marcus called you? About 3 weeks ago. Said he was concerned about your mental state. Asked about the process for obtaining guardianship. What would be required? How long it typically takes. James leaned forward, his attorney instincts clearly activated. Diana, what's really going on here? That's what I came to discuss with you. James, I need legal advice, and I need it from someone I can trust completely. Diana met his eyes directly. What I'm about to tell you will probably shock you, but I need you to hear me out. I'm listening. Diana took a deep breath and began her story. She told him about Robert's death and her retreat into performed confusion, about the overheard phone conversation, about Marcus and Jennifer's plans to have her declared incompetent. She explained about the documented evidence of her decline, about her medical appointment with Dr. Martinez, about the urgent need to protect her legal rights before her family could act against her. James listened without interruption, his expression growing more grave with each revelation. When she finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, clearly processing the legal implications of what he'd heard. "Diana," he said finally, "this is one of the most complex situations I've encountered in 25 years of practice. You're essentially asking me to help protect you from a guardianship proceeding that your own behavior has made possible. I know how it sounds." "No, let me finish." James held up a hand. "You're asking me to help protect you from that proceeding, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you succeed." Relief flooded through Diana's chest. "James, do you remember what you taught me about Lady Macbeth?" he asked unexpectedly. Diana blinked at the literary reference. "I taught you about many Shakespeare characters. You said that Lady Macbeth's greatest tragedy wasn't her ambition or her guilt. It was that she forgot who she really was underneath the role she played. You said that when we perform a character too long, we risk losing ourselves in the performance." James smiled grimly. "Seems like you taught that lesson better than you remembered it." "James, I need to know, how much legal trouble am I in?" "Honestly, a significant amount." Missouri law allows family members to petition for guardianship based on evidence of incapacity. Your son has been collecting that evidence for months, apparently with your unwitting cooperation. James pulled a legal pad from his desk drawer and began making notes. "But there are several factors working in your favor." "Such as?" "First, you're here voluntarily, seeking legal counsel and demonstrating clear competence in doing so. Second, you have recent medical documentation of your cognitive abilities. Third, guardianship proceedings require clear and convincing evidence of incapacity, not just family concerns." Diana felt some of her tension ease. "What do we need to do?" "Several things, and we need to do them quickly." James was writing rapidly now, creating what looked like a legal strategy. "First, we're going to create comprehensive documentation of your current mental status and decision-making capacity. I'll arrange for an independent psychological evaluation by someone the courts trust. Dr. Martinez already referred me to a neuropsychologist." "Good, but we need more than medical assessments. We need documentation that you understand your financial situation, your property rights, the implications of different living arrangements. We need to show that you're not just cognitively intact, but that you're actively engaged in managing your own affairs." James flipped to a new page. "Second, we're going to create new legal documents that establish your wishes clearly and name people you trust to advocate for you if needed." "What kind of documents?" "Updated will, durable power of attorney for finances, advance directive for health care, and something called a designation of standby guardian. This last one is crucial. It allows you to name someone you trust to serve as guardian if one is ever needed, rather than leaving that decision to the courts." Diana considered this. "Who would I name?" "That's up to you. But it should be someone who respects your independence and would advocate for your wishes, rather than their own convenience." James paused. "Diana, I need to ask you something sensitive. Do you want to completely exclude Marcus from your financial and medical decision-making?" The question hit harder than Diana had expected. Despite everything, Marcus was still her son. "I don't want to shut him out entirely, but I can't trust him to put my interests ahead of his financial needs." "Understood. We can structure things so that he has a role in your care if needed, but with oversight and limitations." James made more notes. "Third, we're going to file a preemptive motion with the court." "What kind of motion?" "A declaration of competency. We'll ask the court to officially recognize your mental capacity and decision-making ability. It's an unusual step, but given the circumstances, it could prevent your family from successfully filing for guardianship later." Diana felt a spark of hope. "Can we do that?" Missouri law allows individuals to seek judicial recognition of their competency, especially when there's reason to believe family members might challenge it. "With your medical documentation and psychological evaluation, we have a strong case." "How long does all this take?" James's expression grew serious. That's the challenge. Creating the documents and gathering the evidence will take at least 2 weeks. Court proceedings can take months. But Diana, guardianship petitions can be filed quickly, and once they're filed, you could be restricted from making major decisions until the matter is resolved. How quickly could Marcus file? If he has the documentation he thinks he has, he could file this week. Diana felt the walls closing in again. So we're racing against time. Yes, but we're not helpless. There are things we can do immediately to protect you. James pulled out a different form. First, we're going to create an emergency durable power of attorney and advance directive today, before you leave this office. This ensures that even if guardianship proceedings are filed, you have legal documents establishing your wishes and your chosen advocates. Who should I name as my agent? Someone you trust completely, who lives locally, and who has the backbone to advocate for you even if it means opposing your family. James paused. What about your friend Ruby? You mentioned she's been supportive. Ruby would fight for me, but she's not family. Would the courts accept her? Absolutely. The agent you choose doesn't have to be a family member. In fact, sometimes it's better if they're not, especially when there are family conflicts over the person's care. They spent the next hour creating the emergency documents. Diana found the process both empowering and sobering, making explicit decisions about her medical care, her financial management, her end-of-life wishes. These were conversations she'd avoided since Robert's death, partly from grief and partly from the superstitious fear that planning for incapacity might somehow invite it. Diana, James said as they finished the documents, I need to prepare you for something. When your family discovers that you've regained your clarity and that you've taken legal steps to protect yourself, they may escalate their efforts quickly. What do you mean? They may file for emergency guardianship, claiming that you're being manipulated or that your apparent improvement is temporary. They may challenge your competency more aggressively. And they may. James hesitated. They may feel betrayed by your deception and react emotionally rather than rationally. Diana thought about Marcus's voice during that phone conversation, the casual dismissal, the cold calculation. James, I don't think this is really about my welfare. I think it's about money, and people who need money can be desperate. Which is why we need to move quickly and carefully. James signed the documents they'd prepared and handed Diana copies. I want you to keep these with you at all times. If anyone questions your capacity or tries to make decisions for you, you have legal documentation of your competency and your chosen advocates. What's our next step? I'm calling Dr. Wong's office this afternoon to expedite your psychological evaluation. I'm also going to reach out to a few trusted colleagues about the declaration of competency motion. It's an unusual legal strategy, and I want to make sure we approach it correctly. James stood, signaling the end of their appointment. Diana, I need you to be very careful over the next few weeks. Don't give your family any ammunition they can use against you. Don't seem confused or forgetful, even in casual conversation. And if they try to discuss your living situation or medical care, refer them to me. Should I tell them about today? Not yet. Let's get your psychological evaluation completed and your legal documentation finalized first. Once we have a complete picture of your competency, we can decide how and when to reveal your change in status. As Diana prepared to leave, James touched her arm gently. Diana, I want you to know something. What you're doing, fighting for your independence and dignity, it's not just about you. There are a lot of elderly people in this town who face pressure from well-meaning family members who think they know what's best. Your case could set an important precedent. I'm not trying to be a precedent, James. I'm just trying to keep my home. Sometimes those are the same thing. James smiled, and for a moment Diana saw the earnest teenager she'd once taught. You know, you always told us that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was action in spite of fear. You're living that lesson now. Diana walked out of James Murphy's office feeling something she hadn't experienced in 2 years. The sense that she had advocates, that she wasn't facing this battle alone. The legal documents in her purse felt like armor, protection against the forces that threatened to strip away her independence. But as she drove home through the familiar streets of Cedar Grove, Diana also felt the weight of what lay ahead. The battle for her freedom was no longer a theoretical possibility. It was happening, and the outcome would determine whether she spent her remaining years as an independent woman or as a ward of people who saw her as an inconvenience to be managed. The performance was over, but the real drama was just beginning. The October afternoon sun cast long shadows across Diana's garden as she stood at her kitchen window, watching Frank Kowalski work among the rose bushes she and Tommy had planted just weeks before. His movements were careful and deliberate, the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that gardens, like people, required patient attention to flourish. For months, she had watched him tend to her yard while pretending not to notice, allowing his kindness while hiding behind her performance of confusion. Today, that performance felt like a betrayal, not just of herself, but of him. Diana filled 2 mugs with coffee and walked outside, her steps sure and purposeful. Frank looked up at her approach, his weathered face registering surprise at her clear, confident bearing. "Good afternoon, Frank," she said, offering him one of the mugs. "I thought you might like some coffee." He straightened slowly, accepting the mug with hands that bore the calluses of decades of honest work. His eyes, Robert's blue but deeper, more cautious, studied her face with the attention of someone who had learned to read subtle changes in the people around him. "You're different today, Diana," he said simply. "You sound like yourself again." The observation, delivered without judgment or surprise, nearly undid her. "You knew, didn't you? You knew I wasn't as confused as I seemed." Frank sipped his coffee, considering his words. "I knew you were grieving. I knew you were lost. But confused?" He shook his head. "Someone who's truly confused doesn't maintain a garden bed with the precision you've been using. Doesn't remember exactly which roses need what kind of care, even when they're pretending to forget other things." Diana felt heat rise in her cheeks. "How long have you known?" "Since about the 3rd time you forgot my name while giving me detailed instructions on how to prune the climbing roses." Frank's mouth quirked into the hint of a smile. "You're many things, Diana Kraft, but you're not a good liar." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the evidence of Frank's patient care. The lawn was perfectly maintained, the flower beds weeded and mulched, the autumn cleanup already well underway. Diana realized that while she'd been hiding from life, Frank had been quietly preserving the beauty that she and Robert had created together. "Frank, I need to tell you something important," Diana said, "and I need to ask for your help." His expression grew serious. "I'm listening." Diana told him everything, about the overheard phone conversation, about Marcus and Jennifer's plans, about her visits to Dr. Martinez and James Murphy. Frank listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each revelation. "So your son plans to sell this place?" Frank asked when she finished. "That's his intention. He sees it as a solution to his financial problems." Frank looked around the property, the Victorian house with its wraparound porch, the mature trees Robert had planted when Marcus was a boy, the gardens they'd cultivated through decades of patient work. "This place has been in your family for how long?" 3 generations. Robert's grandfather built the original house. We added the modern conveniences and expanded the gardens, but the bones of it go back to 1892. And Marcus would sell it to developers? Based on the notes I found, yes. Strip centers, maybe senior housing. Ironic, isn't it? Frank's jaw tightened. "That's not ironic, Diana. That's tragic." He set down his coffee mug and faced her directly. "What do you need from me?" "I need witnesses to my competency. People who can testify that I'm capable of making my own decisions, managing my own affairs." Diana paused. "And I need friends who won't let me face this battle alone." "You have both," Frank said without hesitation. "But Diana, I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear." "What?" "Your son called me 2 weeks ago, asked about your behavior, whether I'd noticed any concerning changes in your functioning." Diana's stomach dropped. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you seemed sad but competent. That grief affects people differently. That you were perfectly capable of managing your household and making decisions about your property." Frank's expression grew grim. He didn't seem pleased with my assessment. Did he ask you to document anything? To report specific incidents? He suggested I keep track of any, quote, episodes I might witness. Said it would be helpful for your medical care. Frank shook his head. I told him I wasn't comfortable spying on a neighbor who'd never been anything but kind to me. Diana felt a rush of gratitude mixed with apprehension. Frank's refusal to participate in Marcus's evidence gathering was a relief, but it also meant her son was casting a wider net than she'd realized. Frank, there's something else I need to tell you, Diana said. Ruby's daughter Lisa is driving down from Chicago this weekend. She's a digital marketing specialist, and she's offered to help document my competency through modern methods. Video recordings, social media posts showing my activities and capabilities. Social media? Frank looked skeptical. I know it sounds strange, but James, my attorney, says that in today's legal environment, demonstrating active engagement with technology and current events can be important evidence of mental acuity. Diana smiled at Frank's expression. Don't worry, I'm not planning to become an influencer. But Lisa thinks we can create a digital record of my capabilities that would be difficult for Marcus to dismiss. And this Lisa, Ruby's daughter, she's trustworthy? Ruby trusts her completely, and Ruby's judgment has been impeccable so far. Diana paused. Frank, I know this situation is complicated, and I understand if you don't want to get involved in family drama. Diana. Frank's voice carried a quiet authority that stopped her mid-sentence. 3 years ago, when Margaret died, I thought my life was over. I had friends and neighbors who brought casseroles and offered condolences, but most of them eventually moved on with their own lives. You were different. Diana remembered those dark months after Frank's wife had passed. She'd been so deep in her own grief that she'd barely acknowledged his loss. You didn't bring casseroles, Frank continued. You brought books, poetry mostly. You'd leave them on my porch with little notes about why you thought I might like them. Never intrusive, never demanding conversation I wasn't ready for. Just present, reminding me that beauty still existed in the world. Diana felt tears prick her eyes. She'd forgotten about the books, small gestures that had felt inadequate in the face of his loss. You helped me remember who I was beneath the grief, Frank said. Someone who could still appreciate literature, still find meaning in carefully chosen words. You gave me back my love of reading, which gave me back my love of thinking, which eventually gave me back my love of living. Frank, so when you ask for my help protecting your independence and dignity, the answer isn't just yes. The answer is, what took you so long to ask? Before Diana could respond, her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and felt her blood chill. Marcus, she said. Answer it, Frank advised. But remember, you're not confused anymore. Don't give him any ammunition. Diana answered on the fourth ring, modulating her voice to something approaching her old confused persona, but not quite as vague as before. Hello? Mom? It's Marcus. How are you feeling today? I'm fine, dear. Just having coffee in the garden with Frank. Frank's there? Good, good. Mom, Jennifer and I were thinking we should come visit this weekend. Spend some time with you, maybe discuss some options for your care. Diana's grip tightened on the phone. The timeline was accelerating. Options? Well, we've been talking to some people about facilities that might be more suitable for someone in your situation. Places where you'd have more support, more social interaction. I have plenty of social interaction here, Marcus. Ruby visits regularly. Frank helps with the garden. Tommy comes by most weekends. Yes, but Mom. Marcus's voice took on the patient tone of someone speaking to a child. You need professional care. Supervision. We've been very worried about you. Diana looked at Frank, who was listening intently. He nodded encouragingly. I appreciate your concern, Marcus, but I'm managing quite well on my own. Dr. Martinez says I'm in good health. When did you see Dr. Martinez? Diana realized her mistake too late. The confused woman Marcus expected wouldn't have been capable of scheduling and attending a doctor's appointment independently. Earlier this week, she said carefully, Ruby drove me for my regular checkup. Ruby drove you? Mom, you've been driving yourself places for months. Are you having trouble with the car? Another trap. Diana's mind raced. No, the car is fine. Ruby just offered, and I thought it would be nice to have company." "I see." Marcus's voice had grown cooler. "Well, we'll talk more when we visit this weekend. Is Saturday good for you?" "Saturday is fine, Marcus. Good. And Mom? Maybe you shouldn't be making any major decisions until we can sit down and talk things through properly. You know, financial matters, household changes, anything like that." The warning was clear, though couched in concern. Diana felt Frank's steadying presence beside her. "I understand, dear. I'll see you Saturday." After she hung up, Frank studied her expression. "He's suspicious." "Yes." I slipped up. Mentioned the doctor's appointment. Sounded too coherent. Diana rubbed her temples. "He's coming Saturday with Jennifer." "I think they're planning to present me with a fait accompli." "Then we'd better be ready for them." As if summoned by their conversation, Ruby's compact blue car pulled into the driveway. Behind her, in a sleek gray sedan, came a younger woman with Ruby's determined bearing but softer features. "Reinforcements," Frank observed with satisfaction. Ruby emerged from her car, like a general preparing for battle, immediately followed by her daughter Lisa. A woman in her 30s, with dark hair, pulled back in a professional ponytail, and the kind of focused energy that suggested she was accustomed to solving problems quickly and efficiently. "Diana," Ruby called out, "we need to talk." Lisa drove straight through from Chicago, and she has ideas. Lisa Chen Rodriguez strode across the lawn with the confidence of someone comfortable in any environment. She shook Diana's hand firmly, then turned to Frank with the same direct attention. "You must be Frank. Mom's told me about you. I understand you've been looking after Diana's property?" "I help where I can," Frank replied simply. "Good. We're going to need documentation of Diana's capabilities and independence, and property maintenance is actually excellent evidence of decision-making capacity and future planning." Lisa pulled out her phone. "I hope you don't mind, but I'd like to record some conversations and activities over the next few days. Nothing invasive, just evidence that Diana is actively engaged in managing her life and property." Diana felt overwhelmed by the sudden mobilization of support. "Lisa, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." Lisa's expression grew serious. "Diana, what your family is planning to do to you happens to elderly women all over this country. Adult children who convince themselves they're acting in their parents' best interest while actually serving their own convenience or financial needs. I document these stories for a living, and I refuse to let it happen to someone my mother cares about." Ruby linked arms with Diana. "Besides, we've already talked to James Murphy. He thinks having multi-generational support will strengthen your case significantly." "James called you?" "This afternoon. He wanted to make sure we understood the timeline and the stakes." Ruby's expression grew fierce. "Diana, your son may be planning to ambush you this weekend, but he has no idea what he's walking into." Frank picked up his coffee mug and looked around the group. "What do you need me to do?" Lisa smiled, and Diana caught a glimpse of Ruby's tactical intelligence in her daughter's eyes. "We're going to show the world exactly who Diana Kraft really is," Lisa said. "And by Saturday, we're going to have enough evidence of her competency to make any guardianship proceeding look like exactly what it is: a family trying to steal from someone they're supposed to protect." Standing in her garden, surrounded by people who saw her clearly and valued her independence, Diana felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death: the strength that comes from genuine community. The battle ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer facing it alone. The performance was over. The real Diana Kraft was back, and she had allies. Saturday morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the October air feel deceptively peaceful. Diana stood at her kitchen window, watching the driveway for the arrival she both dreaded and anticipated. Her allies were in position. Ruby had arrived an hour earlier and was stationed in the living room with a book and her phone, ready to document whatever transpired. Frank was working in the back garden, within earshot but out of sight. Lisa had set up discreet recording equipment throughout the main floor, tiny devices that looked like decorative objects but would capture every word spoken in Diana's home. The plan was simple but risky. Diana would perform just enough confusion to avoid alerting Marcus and Jennifer to her complete recovery, while being competent enough to avoid giving them ammunition for their guardianship case. It was a delicate balance that required her to be the actress she'd become over the past 2 years, but with conscious control rather than grief-driven instinct. Tommy had texted an hour earlier, arriving with parents. "Sorry, Grandma, love you." The boy's torn loyalty was evident, even in the brevity of his message. At precisely 10 o'clock, Marcus's silver SUV pulled into the driveway. Diana watched her son emerge from the driver's seat, his movements sharp with tension. Jennifer followed, carrying what looked like a leather portfolio, her expression set in the determined lines of someone prepared for an unpleasant but necessary task. Tommy climbed out of the back seat, his teenage frame hunched with obvious discomfort. But there was a fourth person, a woman in her 40s wearing a professional gray suit and carrying a briefcase. Diana's stomach clenched as she recognized the setup. This wasn't a family visit, it was an intervention. The doorbell rang with the formal tone of official business rather than family intimacy. Diana took a deep breath and opened the door, modulating her expression to mild confusion mixed with pleasure at seeing her family. "Marcus, Jennifer, Tommy." She smiled warmly, letting just a hint of vagueness color her voice. "What a lovely surprise. I wasn't expecting. Were you coming today?" "We told you yesterday, Mom," Marcus said gently, stepping inside. "We discussed it on the phone, remember?" Diana allowed a flicker of uncertainty to cross her face. "Yesterday? Oh, yes, I think. Was that yesterday? Sometimes the days." She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. Jennifer's eyes were already cataloging details, taking mental notes of Diana's apparent confusion. "Diana, we brought someone we'd like you to meet. This is Sandra Wells. She's a social worker who specializes in helping families navigate care decisions." The social worker stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Mrs. Kraft, it's so nice to meet you. Your family has been very concerned about your well-being." "Concerned?" Diana let her brow furrow slightly. "But I'm fine. Would you like some tea?" "I think I have. Somewhere in the kitchen." "That would be lovely, Grandma," Tommy said quickly, his voice tight with stress. "I'll help you." As they moved toward the kitchen, Diana caught Tommy's eye and gave him the slightest nod. The boy's relief was visible. She was still his grandmother, still aware beneath whatever performance she was giving his parents. Ruby looked up from her book as they entered the living room. "Oh, hello. Diana, you didn't mention you were expecting company." "Ruby, this is my son Marcus and his wife Jennifer," Diana said, her voice carrying just enough uncertainty to suggest she might be struggling to remember relationships. "And this is—" "I'm sorry, dear. What did you say your name was?" "Sandra Wells," the social worker replied, her attention clearly focused on Diana's apparent confusion about names and relationships. "Ruby Chen," Ruby introduced herself, rising to shake hands. "I'm Diana's friend. We play bridge together." She paused deliberately. When Diana remembers our game days, of course. Diana felt a flash of admiration for Ruby's tactical support. Her friend was providing evidence of Diana's supposed confusion while maintaining her own credibility as a witness. "Mrs. Chen," Sandra Wells said, "perhaps you could give us some insight into Mrs. Kraft's daily functioning? As a friend who sees her regularly?" "Well," Ruby said carefully, "Diana has good days and difficult days. Today seems to be somewhere in between." Marcus was studying the room, noting details with the sharp attention of someone looking for evidence. Diana realized he was cataloging her environment for signs of incapacity. Unpaid bills, forgotten tasks, evidence of poor decision-making. "Mom," Marcus said, "have you been managing your medications okay? Taking them regularly?" Diana blinked as if trying to remember. "Medications? Oh yes, I think. There's a bottle somewhere, in the kitchen? Or maybe—" She looked genuinely uncertain, which wasn't difficult since she took no daily medications. "Maybe we should check," Jennifer suggested, moving toward the kitchen with the purposeful stride of someone conducting an assessment. Diana followed, watching as Jennifer opened cabinet doors and checked counters. The organized state of her kitchen, clean, well-stocked, everything in its proper place, was clearly not what Jennifer had expected to find. "Your kitchen is very organized," Sandra Wells observed, making notes on a small pad. "Oh, habit, I suppose," Diana said vaguely. "Robert always said, or was it? Someone said organization was important." Tommy was watching this interaction with growing discomfort. Diana could see him struggling with his parents' manipulation, his loyalty to his grandmother, warring with his desire not to disappoint his parents. "Mrs. Kraft," Sandra Wells said, "your family is concerned that you might be having difficulty managing some daily tasks. Are you still driving?" "Driving?" Diana looked confused. "I have a car. It's blue? Or was it gray? Sometimes I forget where I put the keys." This was a calculated risk. Diana had been driving competently for months, but claiming confusion about her vehicle could suggest cognitive impairment without providing specific incidents that could be verified. "When was the last time you drove somewhere?" Sandra continued. Tuesday? Or maybe last week. Ruby sometimes drives when we go to town." Diana glanced at Ruby, who nodded supportively. "Diana's depth perception isn't what it used to be," Ruby added. "I worry about her safety on the road." Marcus was growing more confident as the assessment continued. Diana could see him checking items off a mental list: memory problems, confusion about time, uncertainty about daily activities. "Mom," he said gently, "we're worried about you living alone in this big house. What if something happened? What if you fell or got confused and couldn't get help?" "But I have my friends," Diana said, gesturing toward Ruby. "And Frank helps with the garden. And Tommy visits." "Tommy has school and college preparation," Jennifer interrupted. "He can't be responsible for checking on you. And your friends, while I'm sure they mean well, aren't medical professionals." Diana allowed a look of hurt confusion to cross her face. "But this is my home, Robert and I. We built our life here." "I know, Mom, and no one wants to take that away from you," Marcus said, his voice carrying the patient tone he'd use with a child. "But there are places where you'd be safer, where you'd have people around all the time, activities to keep you engaged." Sandra Wells was taking detailed notes now. "Mrs. Kraft, have you given any thought to what you'd like your living situation to look like going forward?" "I want to stay here," Diana said simply, letting real emotion color her voice. "This is where Robert and I were happy, where we raised Marcus, where my memories are." "But Mom," Marcus said, "memories aren't enough to keep you safe. You need practical support, medical oversight, social interaction with people your own age." "I interact with people," Diana protested. "Ruby and I play bridge. Frank and I talk about the garden. Tommy helps me with—" She paused, looking genuinely confused for a moment. "What do you help me with, Tommy?" Tommy's face was pale with distress. "The roses, Grandma. I help you with the roses." "Oh, yes, the roses." Diana smiled vaguely. "We planted some, didn't we? Or maybe that was last year." Sandra Wells looked up from her notes. "Mr. Kraft, based on my preliminary assessment, your mother does show signs of cognitive confusion and memory impairment. However, she also demonstrates emotional attachment to her home and social connections in her community." Deanna felt the trap closing around her. The social worker was building a case that could support either conclusion, that Diana needed assistance, or that she was functioning adequately with community support. "Mrs. Wells," Jennifer said, pulling out her leather portfolio, "we've been documenting Diana's concerning behaviors for several months. We have detailed records of memory lapses, repeated questions, confusion about daily tasks." She spread papers across Diana's dining room table, the same records Diana and Ruby had discovered in Marcus's briefcase, now presented as official evidence of her incapacity. "These are very thorough notes," Sandra Wells observed, studying Jennifer's documentation. "Mrs. Kraft, do you remember asking your son who he was during his visit last month?" Diana blinked, affecting confusion. "I asked. Sometimes I forget names. People look familiar, but—" "3 times in one afternoon," Marcus added. "She kept asking me who I was and why I was in her house." Tommy's head snapped up. "That's not—" He stopped himself, but Diana caught the beginning of his protest. Her grandson had been there during that visit, had witnessed her deliberate performance, and had just realized the extent to which his parents were distorting her behavior. "What were you going to say, Tommy?" Ruby asked gently. Tommy looked between his parents and his grandmother, clearly torn. Grandma seemed more tired than confused that day. Like she was having trouble focusing, not like she didn't know us. Jennifer's expression grew sharp. Tommy, you told me yourself that Grandma seemed disoriented. I said she seemed sad, Tommy corrected, his voice growing stronger. You asked me if she seemed disoriented, and I said she seemed sad and tired. Diana watched as the dynamic in the room shifted. Tommy was beginning to push back against his parents' narrative, and Sandra Wells was taking note of the family tension. Mrs. Kraft, Sandra said, I'd like to ask you a few specific questions to assess your current mental status. Can you tell me what year it is? It's 2023? Diana said uncertainly. What month? October, I think. The leaves are changing. Who is the current president? Diana paused, looking genuinely confused. Is it still Biden? Or did someone else? Politics is so confusing now. These were calculated responses, mostly correct, but delivered with uncertainty that suggested cognitive cloudiness without indicating severe impairment. Mrs. Kraft, can you count backwards from 100 by sevens? This was dangerous territory. Diana had performed this test perfectly for Dr. Martinez, but now she needed to show some difficulty without appearing completely incompetent. 100. 93. 86. She paused, looking confused. 79? Or is it 81? Numbers are hard for me now. Sandra Wells made more notes. Mrs. Kraft, if you were unable to live independently, who would you want to make decisions about your care? The question hung in the air like a trap. Diana looked around the room, at Marcus, whose tension was barely controlled, at Jennifer, whose calculating expression had softened slightly, at Tommy, whose loyalty was clearly wavering, at Ruby, whose steady presence reminded her that she wasn't facing this alone. I want to stay here, Diana said quietly. This is my home. These are my things, my memories, my life. I understand that Marcus and Jennifer are worried, but I'm not ready to give up my independence. It was the clearest, most coherent statement she'd made during the entire visit, and everyone in the room recognized its significance. Sandra Wells closed her notebook. Mr. and Mrs. Kraft, based on my assessment today, your mother shows some signs of mild cognitive confusion but also demonstrates clear preferences about her living situation and maintains meaningful social connections. I would recommend additional medical evaluation before making any major changes to her living arrangements. Diana felt a surge of victory mixed with apprehension. She had navigated the assessment successfully, but she could see the frustration building in Marcus's expression. What kind of additional evaluation? He asked. Neuropsychological testing, updated medical assessment, perhaps an occupational therapy evaluation, to assess her ability to manage daily tasks safely. And in the meantime, Jennifer pressed. In the meantime, Mrs. Kraft appears to be functioning adequately with community support. However, I would recommend increased oversight and perhaps some home safety modifications. As Sandra Wells packed her materials and prepared to leave, Diana caught Tommy's eye. Her grandson was looking at her with a new understanding, and she could see the moment when his loyalty shifted completely to her side. The performance had succeeded, but Diana knew it was only the first round. Marcus and Jennifer had been temporarily thwarted, but they wouldn't give up easily. The real battle was still ahead. But for now, she had bought herself time, and she had gained an ally in her grandson. Sometimes, Diana reflected, the most important victories were the smallest ones. The tension in Diana's living room was palpable after Sandra Wells departed, leaving behind the acrid scent of professional assessment and family dysfunction. Marcus stood by the window, his jaw clenched as he watched the social worker's car disappear down the tree-lined street. Jennifer sat rigidly on the sofa, her carefully organized portfolio of evidence spread across the coffee table like accusatory documents in a trial. Tommy remained near his grandmother, his young face marked by the dawning realization of what his parents had been orchestrating. Ruby had retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of making tea, but Diana knew her friend was monitoring the situation, ready to intervene if needed. The discreet recording devices Lisa had placed were capturing every word, though Diana wondered if any of them would survive what felt like an impending explosion. "Well, that didn't go as planned," Marcus said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "The social worker seemed impressed with Grandma's coherence," Tommy observed. His tone carefully neutral, but his meaning clear. Jennifer's head snapped toward her son. "Tommy, your grandmother was clearly confused during that assessment. You heard her. She couldn't remember basic information, couldn't count properly, didn't even know what day we'd arranged to visit." "But she knew who we were," Tommy replied, his 16-year-old voice gaining strength. "She knew where she lived, what year it was, who the president is. She seemed more careful than confused." Diana felt her heart race. Tommy was defending her, but he was also coming dangerously close to revealing her performance. She needed to navigate this carefully. "Sometimes I have good moments and bad moments," Diana said vaguely, maintaining her uncertain persona. Today felt clearer somehow. Marcus turned from the window, his expression dark. "Mom, we need to talk honestly about your situation. The social worker might have been impressed by your performance today, but we've been watching you decline for months." The word performance hit Diana like a physical blow. Did Marcus suspect? Or was he simply frustrated that she'd seemed more competent than he'd expected? "It wasn't a performance, Dad," Tommy said, his voice rising slightly. "Grandma was just being herself." "Tommy, you don't understand the complexities of elder care," Jennifer interjected, her nursing background evident in her authoritative tone. "Your grandmother has been exhibiting classic signs of cognitive decline, memory loss, confusion, inability to manage daily tasks." "Like what tasks?" Tommy challenged. "Her house is spotless, her bills are paid, her garden is beautiful. What exactly can't she manage?" Diana watched this exchange with growing alarm. Tommy was fighting for her, but his challenges were forcing Marcus and Jennifer to be more specific about their accusations and more defensive about their motives. "Tommy, you're 16, Marcus said sharply. "You don't understand the financial realities of maintaining this property, the safety concerns of an elderly woman living alone, the medical supervision she needs." "But she has friends who help," Tommy protested. "Ruby visits all the time, Frank takes care of the yard, Dr. Martinez sees her regularly. She's not alone." "Friends aren't family," Jennifer said firmly. "They can't make medical decisions or handle financial matters. They can't provide the kind of professional care your grandmother needs." "What I need," Diana said quietly, letting her real voice emerge for just a moment, "is to stay in my home." The clarity of her statement seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. Marcus stared at her, his expression shifting from frustration to something more complex. "Mom," he said slowly, "you just spoke with more clarity than you've shown in months. What's going on?" This was the moment Diana had been dreading and anticipating. The performance was becoming impossible to maintain under the pressure of family confrontation and Tommy's unwitting exposure of her capabilities. "I have moments," she said carefully, "when the fog lifts, when I remember who I am." "And who are you, Grandma?" Tommy asked gently, and Diana realized her grandson was giving her permission to reveal herself. Diana looked around the room, at the Victorian furniture she and Robert had chosen together, at the family photographs spanning decades of shared history, at the books lining the shelves that represented her life's passion for literature and learning. This was her sanctuary, her identity made manifest in wood and fabric and memory. "I'm Diana Kraft," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm a retired English teacher who spent 45 years educating young people in this community. I'm a widow who lost the love of her life and struggled to find meaning without him. I'm a mother who raised a son in this house. And I'm a woman who refuses to be dismissed as incompetent simply because I've been grieving." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like betrayal. "You've been pretending," he said flatly. "All this time you've been pretending to be confused." "Not pretending," Diana corrected. Protecting myself. Hiding from a world that suddenly felt too overwhelming to face. Jennifer's voice was sharp when she spoke. Diana, do you have any idea what you've put us through? The worry, the stress, the arrangements we've been making for your care? The arrangements you've been making for my property, Diana replied, her teacher's authority finally emerging fully. I overheard your phone conversation, Jennifer. I know about Sunset Manor, about the property assessment, about your plans to sell my home to solve your financial problems. Marcus's face flushed red. You were listening to our private conversation? I accidentally picked up the phone while you were talking. And what I heard was my son dismissing me as too senile to know while planning to steal my independence and my home. Tommy's sharp intake of breath was audible. Dad, you said Grandma was too senile to know what? It's not stealing, Marcus said defensively, his voice rising. We're trying to take care of her, to make sure she's safe and properly supervised. While conveniently solving your financial problems in the process, Diana replied. 14 acres of prime development land should handle college tuition and your mortgage quite nicely. It's not just about money, Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Diana stood, drawing herself to her full height. Marcus, when was the last time you visited me without discussing my supposed limitations? When did you last ask about my feelings, my fears, my hopes for the future? When did you last see me as a person rather than a problem to be solved? Tommy was staring at his father with a look of dawning horror. Dad, were you really planning to take Grandma's house? Tommy, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, Tommy interrupted, his young voice cracking with emotion. You've been lying to me, asking me to spy on Grandma, trying to make me part of your scheme to steal from her. It's not stealing, Jennifer snapped. Your grandmother needs professional care, and this property is too much for her to manage. We're trying to ensure she has the resources for proper supervision while preserving the family assets. Whose family? Diana asked pointedly. Because last I checked, this was my property, earned through my work and my husband's labor. Since when do my assets become family resources for you to manage? Ruby appeared in the doorway, carrying a tea tray but clearly having heard the raised voices. Is everything all right in here? No, Tommy said firmly. Everything is not all right. My parents have been planning to steal Grandma's house by having her declared incompetent, and they've been using me to gather evidence against her. Tommy, that's not, Marcus began. It's exactly what you've been doing, Tommy said, his teenage outrage fully activated. You coached me on what to look for, what to report. You made me feel like I was helping Grandma when I was actually helping you hurt her. Diana felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her grandson's pain. Marcus and Jennifer had turned their own child into an unwitting weapon against her, and Tommy was only now realizing the extent of his manipulation. Son, Marcus said, his voice suddenly weary, you don't understand the pressure we're under. The financial stress, the worry about Mom's safety, the responsibility of managing her care. What I understand, Tommy replied, is that Grandma was never as confused as you claimed she was. What I understand is that you saw her sadness and decided it was incompetence. What I understand is that you were willing to destroy her life to fix yours. The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Diana watched her son's face crumple as the weight of his actions became undeniable. I thought, Marcus's voice broke. She seemed so lost, so unable to cope. I thought we were helping. You thought you were solving your problems, Diana said, her voice gentler now that she could see his genuine distress. Marcus, I was lost. I was struggling. But struggling isn't the same as being incompetent, and grief isn't the same as dementia. Jennifer stood abruptly, her professional composure finally cracking. This is ridiculous. Diana, if you've been capable all along, then you've been manipulating all of us. You've made us worry unnecessarily, caused us to make arrangements based on false information. I've been protecting myself the only way I knew how, Diana replied. And apparently, I was right to be concerned about my safety, just not in the way I expected. What's that supposed to mean? It means the threat to my well-being wasn't from my grief, or my age, or my supposed confusion. It was from my own family, who saw my vulnerability as an opportunity. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Marcus sank into Robert's old chair, his head in his hands. "God, what have we done?" he whispered. Tommy moved to his grandmother's side, his young face set with determination. "Grandma, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I helped them, even accidentally. I'm sorry I didn't see what was really happening." "Tommy, you have nothing to apologize for," Diana said, touching his shoulder. "You were trying to help someone you love. That's never wrong, even when the information you're given is misguided." Ruby set down the tea tray and looked around the room with the assessment of someone who had witnessed many family crises. "It seems to me," she said calmly, "that everyone in this room loves Diana. The question is, what are you going to do with that love now?" Marcus looked up from his hands, his eyes red with exhaustion and shame. "Mom, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to undo what we've planned, what we've set in motion." "You start," Diana said firmly, "by respecting my choices, by seeing me as a competent adult who can make her own decisions about her life, her care, and her property. And you stop trying to use Tommy as a spy," Tommy added, his voice still shaky but determined. Jennifer looked between her husband and son, clearly realizing that the family dynamic had shifted permanently. "What about our financial situation? The college costs, the mortgage?" "What about asking for help instead of trying to steal it?" Diana replied. "What about treating me like family instead of like a resource to be harvested?" Marcus raised his head, meeting his mother's eyes for the first time since his arrival. "Mom, can you forgive us? Can we start over?" Diana looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the calculating man who had planned to steal her independence, but the frightened, overwhelmed middle-aged man who was struggling to hold his own life together. "Marcus," she said softly, "forgiveness isn't the question. The question is, can you learn to see me as I really am instead of as you need me to be?" "I want to try," he said quietly. "Then we start there," Diana replied. "We start with truth." And for the first time in 2 years, Diana Kraft felt like herself again. Not the grieving widow, not the confused elderly woman, but the strong, intelligent, capable person she had always been. The performance was finally, completely over. 3 weeks after the family confrontation, Diana stood in her kitchen watching the morning news on her tablet, a device Tommy had insisted she learn to use. The anchor was discussing a story that had gone viral across social media platforms. Missouri grandmother's fight for independence sparks national conversation about elder rights. Lisa's documentation efforts had exceeded everyone's expectations. What began as simple evidence gathering for Diana's legal case had evolved into a compelling narrative that resonated far beyond Cedar Grove. The story of a sharp-minded widow fighting to keep her independence against well-meaning but misguided family members had struck a chord with thousands of people across the country. The kitchen phone rang, the same rotary phone where this entire saga had begun. Diana answered with the clear, confident voice that had become her natural tone again. "Diana? It's Helen Morrison from the Senior Center." The voice belonged to a woman Diana had taught 30 years earlier. "I hope you don't mind me calling, but I saw the news story about your situation, and I wanted you to know how proud I am of you." Diana smiled. Over the past weeks, she'd received dozens of similar calls. Former students, community members, people who remembered her from her teaching days and were inspired by her refusal to be diminished. "Thank you, Helen. That means more than you know. Diana, I'm calling because we have a proposition for you. Several of us have been talking, and we'd like to know if you'd consider teaching again." "Teaching?" Diana felt a flutter of interest mixed with apprehension. "Helen, I'm 72 years old." "So?" Mrs. Patterson taught at the community college until she was 81. We're not talking about a full classroom load, just a few literature classes for seniors who want to keep their minds active. Book clubs, discussion groups, maybe some creative writing workshops. Diana found herself intrigued. Since reclaiming her voice, she'd been searching for ways to channel her renewed energy and purpose. Teaching had always been more than a career for her. It was a calling. Where would these classes be held? "Well, that's the other part of our proposition. We've heard you have a beautiful Victorian home with plenty of space. Several people have suggested it would make a perfect community learning center." Before Diana could respond, she saw Frank's familiar figure crossing her yard, followed by Ruby and Tommy. Through the window, she could see Lisa setting up what looked like filming equipment in the garden. "Helen, can I call you back? I have company arriving." "Of course." "Diana, just think about it. This community needs what you have to offer." As Diana hung up, she realized that Helen's call represented something she hadn't expected: the opportunity to transform her fight for independence into something larger, something that could benefit others facing similar struggles. Ruby burst through the kitchen door without knocking, a privilege she'd earned through weeks of unwavering support. "Diana, you need to see this. Lisa's social media campaign has caught the attention of the state legislature." "The legislature?" Tommy followed Ruby inside, his phone in hand and his face animated with excitement. "Grandma, there's a state representative who wants to interview you about elder rights legislation. She says your story illustrates problems with the current guardianship laws." Frank entered more quietly, but his expression carried the same mix of pride and amazement that Diana had been seeing in her supporters' faces for weeks. "Diana, there are 3 news vans parked at the end of your street. Word has gotten out that this is where the story originated." Lisa appeared in the doorway, her professional camera equipment making her look like the documentary filmmaker she'd become over the past month. "Diana, I need to ask your permission for something. A national news program wants to feature your story as part of a series on elder advocacy, but it would mean more publicity, more attention." Diana felt overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of what had begun as a personal battle for independence. "I don't know if I'm ready for national attention." "You don't have to decide today," Ruby said, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. "But Diana, you need to understand something. Your story has given other people courage to fight for their own independence. We're getting emails from families across the country, adult children who are reconsidering their assumptions about their aging parents, elderly people who feel empowered to resist being pushed into situations they don't want." Tommy pulled up something on his phone. "Grandma, look at this hashtag, #NotTooOldToChoose. There are thousands of posts from people sharing their own stories." Diana scrolled through the posts Tommy showed her, reading accounts from elderly individuals who had been pressured by families, who had felt invisible and dismissed, who had found strength in her example. The scope of the issue she'd stumbled into was staggering. "There's something else," Frank said quietly. "Marcus called me yesterday." Diana looked up sharply. In the 3 weeks since their confrontation, her relationship with Marcus had been cautiously cordial but strained. He and Jennifer were attending family counseling, trying to understand how their financial stress had led them to such ethically questionable decisions. "What did he say?" "He wanted to know if you were okay with all the attention, if you felt supported. He also wanted me to tell you that he's spoken with James Murphy about formally withdrawing any plans for guardianship proceedings." "He has?" "More than that," Tommy added. "Dad asked James to help him set up a college fund for me that doesn't depend on your property. He's taken a second job and talked to a financial counselor about managing their debt differently." Diana felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Marcus was taking responsibility for his actions, sadness that their relationship required such formal legal boundaries, and cautious hope that they might eventually rebuild their trust. "How is he handling the publicity?" Diana asked. "Better than Mom expected," Tommy admitted. "At first he was embarrassed that their plans had become public. But now he says he's proud that you're helping other families avoid the mistakes they almost made." Lisa had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. "Diana, there's something else you should know. 3 other communities in Missouri have contacted me about setting up elder advocacy programs based on what's happened here in Cedar Grove. They want to create support networks for elderly residents who might be facing family pressure. And," Ruby added with a sly smile, "the Senior Center isn't the only organization that wants to partner with you. The library system is interested in hosting literary programs, the community college wants you to develop continuing education courses for older adults, and there's a nonprofit organization that wants to fund a pilot program for elder advocacy." Diana sat down heavily in her chair, processing the transformation of her quiet retirement into what appeared to be a new career in advocacy and education. I went from being too confused to manage my own life to being asked to help manage programs for entire communities, she said with wonder. That's what happens when you stop hiding your light under a bushel, Frank observed with a gentle smile. Tommy looked up from his phone again. Grandma, there's something else. The high school wants to invite you to speak at graduation this spring. They want you to talk about courage and self-advocacy. They want me to give the commencement address? Diana felt tears prick her eyes. After 45 years of teaching, being invited back to inspire a new generation felt like coming full circle. Principal Martinez says you embody everything they want graduates to understand about standing up for themselves and refusing to be diminished by others' expectations, Tommy explained. Dr. Martinez? Diana asked. Sarah Martinez is the high school principal now? Her sister Maria, Ruby clarified. The Martinez family has been talking about your case. Dr. Sarah has been advocating for better geriatric assessment protocols, and her sister thinks your story would inspire students facing their own challenges with family and social pressure. Diana looked around her kitchen, the same room where she'd overheard that devastating phone conversation just weeks earlier. Now it was filled with people who saw her capabilities rather than her limitations, who valued her contributions rather than viewing her as a burden. What do all of you think I should do? She asked. We think, Frank said, speaking for the group, that you should do what you've been doing. Be yourself, speak your truth, and let the rest follow naturally. The community needs you, Diana, Ruby added, not as a symbol or a cause, but as the intelligent, capable woman you've always been. Diana nodded slowly, feeling the weight and the privilege of unexpected leadership. Her fight for independence had become something larger than herself, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. Outside her kitchen window, she could see the news vans Frank had mentioned, but they no longer seemed threatening. They represented opportunity, the chance to ensure that other people wouldn't have to fight the same battle she'd faced. The performance was over, but the real work was just beginning. 6 months later, Diana stood on her wraparound porch, watching the final preparations for the Craft Center grand opening celebration. Her Victorian home had been transformed into exactly what Helen Morrison had envisioned, a community learning center where elder wisdom met intergenerational exchange. The morning was crisp, with early spring promise. Daffodils bloomed in the garden beds that Frank had carefully restored, and the roses she and Tommy had planted the previous fall were showing their first green shoots. License plates from 3 states filled her driveway and the temporary parking area Frank had created in the side yard. Nervous? Ruby asked, joining Diana on the porch. Her friend carried 2 cups of coffee and wore the satisfied expression of someone whose strategic planning had come to fruition. Excited, Diana corrected, accepting the coffee gratefully. I never imagined grief could lead to something like this. Through the open windows of her home, Diana could hear the sounds of preparation. Lisa was setting up her documentary equipment in the living room. Today's celebration would mark the conclusion of her film about Diana's journey. Tommy was in the kitchen with several of his classmates, preparing refreshments and managing the technology for the virtual attendees who would join the celebration online. Marcus and Jennifer's car pulled into the driveway, and Diana felt the familiar flutter of cautious optimism that marked their interactions these days. Their relationship was different now, more honest but also more careful. Marcus had learned to ask rather than assume, to listen rather than dismiss. It would never be the same as before, but it was real in ways their previous dynamic had never been. Diana, Frank called from the garden, where he was directing the setup of chairs for the outdoor portion of the celebration. Your first students are arriving. Diana smiled, watching as cars began discharging elderly residents from across the county. People who had heard about the Craft Center and wanted to be part of the book clubs, writing workshops, and discussion groups that would make this house a hub of intellectual activity once again. Dr. Martinez arrived with several colleagues from the medical center, including the neuropsychologist who had documented Diana's cognitive strengths months earlier. James Murphy emerged from his car carrying legal documents, the final paperwork establishing the Craft Center as a nonprofit organization. Mom? Marcus approached the porch, his expression mixing pride with residual shame. Jennifer and I brought something for you. He handed her a framed document, the deed to her property, but amended with legal language that protected it in perpetuity as a community resource. "We wanted to make sure no one could ever threaten your home again, including us." Diana read the document, understanding its significance. This wasn't just legal protection. It was Marcus's public acknowledgement of his mistakes and his commitment to supporting, rather than controlling, her choices. "Thank you," she said simply, and meant it. Tommy bounded onto the porch, his teenage energy infectious. "Grandma, everyone's here," the state representative, the documentary crew, the newspaper reporters, and about 50 people who want to sign up for classes. "And," Ruby added with a grin, 3 adult children who want to apologize to their elderly parents for treating them the way Marcus treated you." Diana laughed, feeling the absurdity and the beauty of how her personal crisis had become a catalyst for broader healing. "I suppose we should begin then." As she walked into her home, now the Craft Center for Lifelong Learning, Diana passed the kitchen phone where this entire journey had started. On impulse, she paused and touched the receiver that had delivered such devastating news 6 months earlier. "Thank you," she whispered to the phone, to the moment, to the pain that had ultimately led to this joy. In the living room, surrounded by 3 generations of people who had learned to see aging as an opportunity rather than a decline, Diana Craft began her new life. Not as a widow hiding from the world, not as a confused elderly woman to be managed, but as a teacher, advocate, and community leader whose greatest lessons had come from refusing to be invisible. The masks were gone. The performance was over. Diana Craft was exactly who she had always been, and finally, everyone could see her clearly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,